My name is Gregory Hansen. I actually think we have an introductory slide. There we are, webinar host. So Harsh, unfortunately, forgot that it's the Eastern time zone, so he's no longer with us this morning. I mean, he's in general still alive, but he's not here doing the webinar. I am Gregory Hansen. I run our sales engineering team here at Smartbear, and I am co-hosting with
Jeffrey Martin, product owner here at Smartbear.
Yeah, Jeff runs our testing products here.
I'm told I need to swallow the mic more. All right.
Excellent. All right. Well, with that, we are going to dive right into our webinar. And along the way, I do have my questions panel open, so feel free to chime in. We will be trying to keep this live and entertaining as we go through. But just so you guys are aware, we're going to be running through at a high level talking about our survey methodology so you can see how we were able to obtain this data, lend a bit of credibility there so it's not just me saying things. Then we're going to talk about some of the general testing trends that we've been able to find, move into test automation, which is a big portion of the presentation. Talk a little bit about test processes and environments, and then at the end we're going to wrap up with a little bit of the future of test automation, not only what we are seeing in the industry, but a lot of the information that we observed from your information on this survey. And marketing put in some nifty animations there, but just on the survey methodology, one, I'd like to thank some of our co-sponsors. We joined forces with Signity and the ever-influential industry group, the Ministry of Testing here in Boston.
Great name.
We got over 3,400 total responses, and we observed those responses from a variety of social networking by sending out links on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. We also emailed a number of our prospects and customers here at Smartbear to get people who are in the industry. We also promoted the survey in product. Of course, in the larger community via Google AdWords and other, again, various social media portions.
You know, as long as we're thanking people, we should probably thank Kirsten, Leanne, other people internally who did so much work on this survey.
I have to say, yes, all Jeff and I had to do was show up today and make sure that we can be entertaining and informative, but the people that did the hard work was the marketing team here at Smartbear Software, putting together this survey, crunching all the numbers, so definitely big props to them. So thank you guys for putting this all together. Excellent. So past the survey methodology, clicking around, we're going to start off with general trends that we're seeing in the testing industry. So the first, what test professionals are saying. And this is actually a word cloud that we got from the open responses in our survey. So obviously you can see automation there being a massive word. So obviously there's a lot of people putting effort into test automation as they're going through. The majority of the comments were around that. So it really shows that automation is top of mind for all of our testers. And then just below that there's tools, but also development. So development coding is really next on top of everyone's mind because we're definitely noticing a correlation between scripting and coding proficiency and the extent of automation, which we'll get to later. Now we do have a couple of pieces of, well, comments from our survey here. So one from our anonymous QA engineer that testing will be considered more as development work. This is one of the things that we saw echoed around, that a lot of people are seeing that developers are going to be more part of the testing process in the automation team. And then we also had a second anonymous QA engineer who was saying more automation and less manual testing.
And these comments were in response to, I think the question was, what do you think the software testing field will look like in 2 years? So you can kind of see a lot of people saying automation, more development centric, but we'll get to that a little bit more in the future trends area.
Excellent. All right, moving on. So testing, obviously moving far beyond just the front end. And so it's not just focused on front end or back end, but a result of doing both of them at the same time. So if you can see here, we've actually got a set of manual testers, QA engineers, and software developers talking about the thing that they were doing most often. And one of the things that you can see is the manual testers are predominantly doing their UI testing, and as you move into the software developers, they are testing more on the API side. However, across all of them, the vast majority of people are testing both, because it's not just testing one side or the other. It's having to test your entire application, all back end and front end.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of kind of interesting insights here. To me, the biggest one is actually how similar they are, with the exception of the software developers. Obviously, the software developers spend a little bit more time testing the back end. I guess that goes without saying. But it does mean that they're farming off a lot more of the kind of UI-centric or interaction pieces still over to the manual testers, despite the trend, being more development-heavy.
Yes. Yeah, and it's very interesting that only 10% of the manual testers are focusing only on API testing. Well, obviously, I mean, testing an API manually, I mean, if anyone's ever had to write API calls and then just continuously write new calls, that's a pretty tedious process. So ideally, we can look at some type of automation to help those people automate some of their API tests. And everyone, I think due to Boston traffic, we now have our very own Harsh, who has joined us. Harsh, are you with us?
Hello, everybody. Good morning. How's it going?
It is a very good morning for those of us who understand to leave early for the webinar.
Word.
Some shade early. All right.
Excellent. All right, Harsh, are you all logged in? Would you like to take over moderation?
Yeah, sure,
responsibilities from me?
definitely.
I used
Hi,
up all my
everybody.
good jokes already, so.
Okay.
Wow.
All right. So thanks, Greg. So I think we have seen that most of the manual testers are doing just 10% of API testing, and software developers are seeing 10% UI testing. So what do you think? Is it
I do not. First off, who's testing an API manually?
Yeah, that's maybe they're manually writing scripts to automatically test their APIs.
Yeah, maybe they just misunderstood what manual versus automation.
Yeah.
But I also only 10% of the software developers testing UI-centric pieces. I think that says a lot that people are really focusing on what they're good at, honestly, which I guess shouldn't be surprising.
Sure. Awesome. So let's move on.
Excellent. So moving to the next area, we've got the testing methodologies showing what people are more predominantly spending their time on.
Yeah, sure. So here we see majority of the people doing unit testing. And then 72%, that's a big number, right? And then automated testing is at 62%. That is pretty much consistent with what we have seen in other results, like 63% on an average. People said that they are doing automated UI testing. And then we have performance testing at 56%. And it is very interesting here that we see that service virtualization is at just 12%. So what do you think? 72% unit testing, is it a high number, or?
I mean, I think that makes sense. Developers should be doing unit testing, let's be honest. I mean, my friend Kevin, who's a developer, and he's not on this webinar, so I can call him out, he doesn't do unit testing. He says it's a waste of time, but I think it's one of the most important building blocks to test your functionality before it gets out. But then as you move on into the more complex type of automation, or more complex type of testing in general, getting into that automated UI testing and then performance testing, and ultimately down to service virtualization, the more involved it gets, the fewer people are going to do it.
I mean, we've all seen that pyramid, right? You have the unit testing on the bottom. It goes up a little bit. What do they call it? The testing pyramid. It makes sense. Unit testing should be the most. It's the foundation of quality. And I'd argue that whether or not you're using a unit framework, developers test their own code for the most part. Automated UI testing, are you surprised it's at 62?
I'm not really. I figure about half people are. I mean, we obviously here at Smartbear have test automation tools. I've talked to a lot of people in the past. For as much as the industry is saying we are shifting left and having the developers building the automation and we're automating everything and 100% of everything needs to be automated, I talk to so many people who just want to automate some of their basic checks so that they can get back to doing some real thorough testing.
So 72% unit testing. So there are people out here who might not be doing it right now. Is that an indication that they should start doing unit testing because most of the peers are doing it? It's
a pretty standard best practice.
Yeah.
If you're not testing your basic code, how do you test how it interacts?
Yeah.
I'm also a little shocked that nowadays performance testing isn't even more prevalent, given how important performance is, not just at load, but at just responsiveness. It's so easy to take a normal automated or unit test and do some level of performance testing with it.
Sure. And what about service virtualization? Just 12%. Is there a need for more evangelization in the industry to let people know the value behind, being able to create sophisticated mocks or emulations of their services?
Yeah, I think we actually have some further information on service virtualization out there. I think it's still too new to have so many people doing it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. All right, so the next slide is on API testing. So we thought that as API testing is getting more and more important, so we should have a section or a slide on API testing. And we asked that what API testing activity are you spending your most time on? And we found that people said that most of the time they are spending is on functional testing, right? And there are people spending most of the time on creating mocks and performance testing. And some people are also spending most of their time on virtualizing their services. And then we also asked them a question around what is the number of unique API endpoints that you use. So 50 was the number. Like most of the people are having less than 50 API endpoints.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the left hand here isn't too shocking, right? Because we asked, what do you spend most of your time on? And if you're going to do load testing, I mean, for every load test, you better be writing, 2 or 3 functional tests. So I guess it makes sense that they're going to spend more time on functional. But predominantly virtualizing services or performance, it sort of implies that there's less specialized load testers out there for APIs, that people spend time writing functional and load testing.
Yeah, I think one of the comments that just came in is there were so few people saying that they did security testing as their most time spent.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Yeah, it was like not significant at all.
It was statistically, it could have been negative people doing security testing.
Are doing it all.
Yeah.
All right, and then, I believe, are we live on the webcam?
Oh, great. Hi, guys.
I can't tell if we are, but I'm waving. I'm waving to the internet. And we have people all over the world. Oh, nope, no webcam. No webcam access. Oh, we're in? Hey, there we go. All right, everyone, welcome. This is Greg, this is Jeff, and Harsh he's off to the side. You can see his hand, I think. Excellent. And just a quick thing on the virtualizing services. Harsh, could you give us the 10-second overview of what virtualizing services is?
Sure. So there are a lot of times when you are doing your software development and testing, and there are resources and components which are not available immediately because of a number of reasons. It could be because they are really expensive to access, or maybe they're under development or hard to access. So what you do is you create really sophisticated emulations of them in form of virtualized services.
Okay,
and,
so an emulated API so that you don't have to have access to
very sophisticated emulated API.
Yeah,
it's like almost like a real API.
Yeah, like if you have a third-party API that you're testing and you don't want to have your tests dependent on that third party, you can virtualize it and then run your tests against that.
And I can see some of the questions coming in. So a mock is basically a less sophisticated version where you're just faking it.
Mock is like you have to spend a lot of time to create a mock, and it's not repeatable. It's not something that you can reuse, and it's stateless. So we have done a couple of webinars on this. So if you're interested, we're going to keep on adding more and more content here and more webinars. So keep tuned to the channels of Smartbear.
I still love that name, mock. When I first learned it, somebody asked me, "What do you guys do around mocking APIs?" And I was like, "Well, it's not nice to make fun of other people's work."
Excellent. So that was wrapping up our API section, and then we're going to move on into test automation.
All right.
Sure. All right. So when we looked at automation, we found that 44% of our participants said that they have 44% of the tests are automated. And if you look at the distribution, we asked them what is the size of the companies, and we compared it to the proportion of tests automated. And we found that smaller companies have less proportion of tests automated, and bigger companies have up to 50% and more than 50% of their tests are automated.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense to me because obviously if you're a smaller company, the people there are more concerned with doing the work and getting the projects out, getting the stuff developed, than building the automation for it. I mean, I've talked to a lot of mobile developers, and they say, look, I'm just trying to get my stuff out there, and then we'll see what happens. So that makes sense. The more people you get, the more time you have to be able to spend on automation, or the bigger you get, the more money you have to spend on automation tools that make it easier to help you out.
I do think there's another piece here, because this goes to coverage. It's easier to get a higher % of coverage if it's a stable application. And big companies tend to use big, stable applications, right? Healthcare systems or ERP systems.
Makes sense.
That internal stuff. It lets you get above that, 20, 30, 40% threshold, because you don't have to keep remaking the old tests.
Yeah, I mean, if your application is drastically changing every single week, automation is a lot more difficult.
Sure. And then we also asked our participants what is their proficiency in scripting. And we put the extent of automation and their scripting proficiency together. And here are the results. So it seems that there is a correlation between your scripting proficiency and the extent to which your tests are automated. So as you can see, beginners just have 11% of the tests automated, and experts have like 64% of the tests automated. So it's a very conclusive evidence that scripting proficiency correlates with higher automation.
Yeah, although it's hard to judge the causality there, right? Because
Yeah.
it could just be people who script well do what they do well.
Or
Yeah.
because they're doing more automation, they're learning scripting better.
Exactly.
So it's like the more you learn, the more what you're
Definitely.
doing.
There is no causality, but I think it's a good thing to keep in mind for our viewers that there is a correlation.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
yes.
absolutely. If you want to be doing more automation, then you're going to want to invest in more scripting. I mean, there are free tools out there, like you can use Selenium for your web automation, but if you're going to be using those free tools, you'd better be good at scripting or writing code because you're going to have to do that, and maybe.
Yeah, I think this goes a little bit to some stuff we're talking about later, but you would think I would know what's coming up.
It's almost like we know and we've done this before.
But it does kind of go to some stuff later on, right? Look, people want more scripting, more automation. That's the trend that keeps coming out through this. If you aren't good at scripting, maybe it's time to invest in some skills.
Yeah, definitely. If you are in the testing field, investing in your scripting skills is highly, highly valuable. And we'll talk about
Yes.
which scripting languages to look into later.
Definitely. All right, so we also asked our participants what industry do they work in, and then we compared the extent of, we asked them what proficiency do they have, and we figured out which industry has people with most scripting proficiency. So you can see, like, for example, nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, 50% testers said that they are really proficient in scripting. And on the other end, we found that media and advertising industry, 28% of the testers said that they are really proficient in scripting. So here, there are some interesting trends. You see, we will expect like finance, banking, and healthcare to have those large number of tests and more automation, and hence you have more people with scripting skills. But then nonprofit and non-governmental organizations with 50% testers who have really good scripting skills. How do you explain that?
Yeah, the thing I pulled out from this is that the people who are concerned with saving money or making money, they are investing in scripting skills. They're investing in automation. And yes, automation is not going to be a replacement for manual testing. I want to get that out of the way now. I would never espouse replacing all of your testing with automation. That's just not probable. But for doing automation, I mean, you look at these companies like nonprofits, they need to spend their money on the good works that they're doing, so they need to be as efficient as possible, whereas industries that are traditionally, more likely to burn cash to keep the office warm, marketing, they will just not spend as much time as in that investment for automation. So definitely if you're looking to save money or save time, invest in automation, invest in scripting.
I mean, this is almost a list of people who care about efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Except I'm surprised the government's up there. I mean, let's be honest, folks. Am I right?
It includes aerospace and defense.
True. They just kind of lumped them in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, basically, yeah, it boils down to, who's really greedy and who wants to save money.
Is it also an indicator that if in case there is not much automation in these sectors, maybe in future there's a lot of potential here for automation tools?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's clear that they have
indicator.
efficiency gains they could gain.
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't like more money?
Or maybe it's a message for media and advertising and retail wholesale to hire more people with scripting skills to add those kind of efficiencies.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about the coding languages used by the testers for their scripting skills. So what we found was that most number of UI testers are using C# and Visual Basic. So higher proportion of UI testers use C# and Visual Basic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, Harsh is telling me to hit to the next slide.
And then there are a higher number of API testers who are using languages like Java, Python, Groovy, and PHP. So there's a little bit of categorization here in terms of languages which are preferred by UI testers versus API testers.
Yeah, I mean, the old stuff seems to be a little bit more on the UI side, right?
Yeah, I mean,
there's a lot of desktop apps out there. Obviously, there's not too many desktop apps that are using APIs as a proportion.
Yep. that makes sense. And the historical automation tools stuck. Wait, can we see the presenter instead? If anyone can't see the presentation, hopefully you can. Just want to make sure that everything's. You might want to resize your GoToMeeting screen there. But yeah, for the old-fashioned automation tools that were stuck with a deprecated language like Visual Basic, that's why you see more UI testers using Visual Basic instead of more modern scripting languages like JavaScript, Python, or just Java itself.
I think it's a good time for us to ask our audience a question now.
We do have a poll. Let's see if I can figure out how to. Oh, it's already done. I don't have to do it.
Yep. So the question is going to be, do you script or do you use a tool to create your UI tests? And if you can answer this question quickly.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised Java's not higher. Anybody else?
So Java overall, 61% said that they use Java.
I mean, that's all.
If that comforts you a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely the most predominant.
I guess we throw JavaScript in there, right? But I mean, look, that's what people come out of school with now.
Okay.
There's not too many people graduating school who are experts in Delphi.
All right. So the answer to the question, we are getting results right now.
Out of curiosity, while they're going through here, you got a favorite, Harsh?
It's Java. Java and then JavaScript.
Makes sense. You're a good decade younger than the rest of us over here.
Yep.
Greg, what are you still writing VB.NET?
No, jeez, no. I did root. My thesis was I did it on Ruby on Rails when it was first coming out, so Ruby has a very close part to my heart.
Okay, so our poll results are in.
Oh, we've got some results.
Yes, 49% said that they script. 33% said they use a tool. 19% they said it's not applicable to them. So 49% said that they use a script for UI testing.
Oh, great. That makes sense.
33% using a tool.
All right. Well, moving on.
Yeah, so
complete opposite.
Well, we thought it's important for us to talk about manual testing. We can't just ignore it, right? So 56% of the people, 56% of tests on an average are still manual. That was the insight we gained here, and primarily very much prevalent in B2C user-centric industries. And then there is a concept of exploratory testing. It's a kind of manual testing. Jeff, do you want to shed a little bit of light upon this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we threw the definition in there, but it's essentially unscripted manual testing. There's a bunch of different techniques, time-based, etc.
And very popular with mid-sized companies. How do you explain that? Mid-sized companies doing more exploratory testing more than the smaller and the bigger-sized companies?
I think it actually makes sense. If you're small, you don't have the time. If you're really large, you try to automate everything. So just because you're looking for all that efficiency gains like we talked about.
Maybe like smaller companies are doing this, but they're not like specifically aware of this term, exploratory testing.
Yeah, that could be a thing. I think, end of the day, exploratory testing is testing your application like a user would manually.
Yeah.
So most people do some level of that. They might not know the term.
So if in case you are doing something of the sort, then we recommend that you should go and look at the best practices around exploratory testing. Like there are people who have done this and they have written stuff about it. There's content out there, read it. Because you know the name now, it's called exploratory testing.
Absolutely. And there are, one of the big things that I've been seeing through the comments here is that automation isn't for everything. There really is no point in trying to automate 100% of your stuff. I can spend 5 days writing a sophisticated automation algorithm that handles a task that I, as a human, can do in 5 seconds.
Yeah, I'm actually speaking on that at Star West, and literally, I think basically the point of my application, my speech is, don't automate everything. Some of it's really hard.
Yeah, I mean, if you have applications that are updating on a weekly basis, then take a look at the functionality that you can automate, that baseline checks that can save you the time, and then do all of the new exploratory testing and migrate those new tests into future automation. But take a look at your application, what makes sense to actually automate.
That said, I still think 56% is high for manual. At the end of the day, we should be getting a little bit higher. But
I don't know for you why that makes sense.
View of the future trends there.
Yeah. All right.
Hold some powder dry.
Well, let's see what happens. Oh, another fade there. I feel like we're in a Star Wars movie. Test processes.
Test processes, and if you can go to the next slide quickly, we can take a look at the overview. So we asked a question like, which process do you use primarily in your day-to-day activities? And we got these results. 63% said that they do some form of Agile. 7% said that they still do pure waterfall. And then there was an interesting category here. They said it depends. It depends maybe on their project or the particular area they're working on right now. So there are people who are like flexible out here.
I think that it depends is going to be mostly people who have more than one project or pieces of their product, and some of the old stuff, it's just, you're locked in. It's hard to just change your methodology if you've been doing it for 5 years. So
And
you
it
leave
could
the
be-
old stuff in Waterfall and new stuff in Agile.
Or it could be that you're doing some amalgamation, and it depends is more of a, well, we do Agile fall-ish.
The boss calls it Agile to the board, and
Yeah.
we call it Waterfall.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
common one.
So Jeff, your comment was interesting that there are projects which are really old, and that kind of
That
explains
doesn't
the
sound like me. Are you sure?
7%. 7% of waterfall teams still doing waterfall, like legacy projects and products out
Well,
there.
once you're doing something, it's actually really hard to switch. So if you've
Yeah.
been doing Waterfall on some big application for 3 years, switching over to Agile, it's a lot of tooling to redo, a lot of structures, processes. Sometimes it's not worth it.
I think we have good insights on this in the next slide, in which we talk about the team sizes. So we asked our respondents what is the size of their teams, and we also asked them to what extent. We pulled the number of teams in each category which are following Agile. So you can see that teams 2 to 5, 63% of them responded that they are following some kind of Agile. So it's interesting here that
By the way, Agile defined by whatever they think Agile
Yeah.
is. Let's not get into a big debate about
Strict Agile.
yeah.
it's some
Whether or
form of
not they
Agile.
call it Agile.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things you see is that as the team size gets that 16 to 15 range, that's where the majority of the people were saying they do Agile, because on teams of 50 or more, it's probably difficult, because then you have, I think the term Scrum of Scrum was used, where I mean that gets really difficult to do a proper Agile implementation. The most surprising thing for me was that on the team of 1, only half of them are being Agile. So there are 50% of the respondents that were a team of themselves feel like they're not running Agilely.
Which they
Seems
should, because they're-
counterintuitive, doesn't it?
I know, but hey, whatever
Never
works
know.
for them.
Old project maybe.
It depends. But yeah, obviously the key size is in that 6 to 15, or even like the 2 to 5 and 6 to 15 range.
So there's a key question here. Is there a sweet spot for team size for success with Agile? Is it like 6 to 15?
I think, honestly, anytime you have a group of people that's over about 15,
It becomes hard.
it's really hard to coordinate them, right?
I mean, think about the last time that you were in a meeting with 30 of your peers, and how effective was that meeting? Like
About as
every
effective
marketing
as any
meeting I
with
look
you
at
in it.
here, I see it's not possible.
But then 50 or more people, teams, 56% still say that they follow some kind of Agile.
I mean, you're going to break that team up, right? That's what you should end up doing. You can't really do Agile with
Absolutely.
50 people.
Absolutely. All right, so test management. So we asked them, do you do test management? And 44% of them said that their teams do test management. And again, if you see the categorization of the team sizes at the bottom in the graph, you would see that it's pretty much consistent across all the team sizes, except like when we go like really big teams, 1,000 to 10,000, they're like less extent of test management than in other teams.
I think it's funny because if you have a test and you've done it more than once, unless it's just held in your brain, you have managed that test in some way. So I think this probably leans more to, do they have a specific tool or format or process for their test management? Because I can't imagine that more than 50% of the caucus there is not doing any form of test management. I mean, I know a lot of people. We have, again, test management platform here at Smartbear Software, and we talk to a vast amount of people who are migrating from all of their test cases are in a Word document that they email around, or in an Excel document that they email around. And while that is test management, I'm thinking that those people would say, no, we don't really have formal test
maybe
management.
that's what it is. They're just being really smart. They're like, what we do, we manage tests, but it's not test management.
Yeah, that's probably.
I think it's a time, that's an interesting question, and we should ask our audience here. So the question is going to be, are you happy with your test management solution? It's very simple, yes or no answer. So if you can quickly take a stab at that.
I'm sorry, does that graph remind you of
It
anything?
absolutely looks like a political map. I'd say that this is the current state of the government, where more than half of them are not happy with the way they're managing their processes.
The Republicans won the House, huh?
They did. That's what it is.
Right.
Is there a definition of test management that you would like to tell our audience, like
That's an
exactly what it
interesting
is?
one.
I think that one's in the eye of the beholder. because
Is it like
everyone,
agile?
yeah,
What
everyone
do you
thinks
call
test
test
management,
management?
because like I said, test management could be I write all my tests in a Word document and we email that around to people.
Yeah.
It's not effective, but it's a thing.
And I think people really did probably interpret this as, do you effectively manage tests, or do you have a formal process around test
Yeah,
management?
that's how I would have read it.
100% of people manage tests. You have to design them, you have to run them, you have to put the results somewhere. You're
Needs to
managing
be a
tests.
process.
Except for those non-agile teams of one.
Maybe
So
they-
those guys
Fair
using
enough.
the 2-year waterfall cycle on their individual teams.
All right, so we have the results in from the poll.
Let's see what it is.
55% said that they are not satisfied with their test management solution. They're not happy with it. And 45%, of course, then.
Hey, that kind of matches the 44% there, doesn't it?
It's very,
Very much correlates with our findings.
excellent. It's always good when our data from the. I always worried about the live polls that they're going to drastically show what our data did not.
Well, you get
but
smaller sample size, but yeah.
I like this one though.
Release cycles, yeah. So we asked the participants how often do they release their software, and we tried to see if there are any differences in release cycles between API projects and UI projects. So if you can hit
Hit next.
one more, next, yes.
Oh,
so
we had a build.
Oh, yeah. So we find that for APIs, more APIs are released multiple times a day and weekly than UI. So you would see on the left side, there are a higher proportion of API releases happening than UI releases. But if you go to another insight that we got,
More builds.
yes, so more UI projects are released than API quarterly. So if the release cycle increases in size, we find that more UI projects are getting released than APIs. And I think there is a little bit of a trend from our last year's findings and this year's findings. So we are seeing that more people are saying that they're releasing weekly and monthly this year than they said last year. Last year it was primarily more quarterly and monthly.
Yeah. So yes, we did a state of testing survey. It was, I think, 2014 actually, and it was funny because it was the exact same chart, but everything was just shifted over where weekly was the one that very few people were doing, and then monthly was about a third of the people. So and everyone said, hey, where do you expect they're going to go? And they were saying more frequent releases, and here we are 3 years later, and people are doing much more frequent releases. So I would expect that in the next 3 to 5 years, this is going to continue to shift into that multiple times, weekly, once a day, multiple times a day. I mean, probably not your front-end applications you're going to be pushing on multiple times a day, but as APIs consume the world, those are going to be actively updated.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a limit there on weekly. Most applications, unless it's a website or something, very specific, like really consumed and constantly changing, published applications, I'll say.
Yeah.
You don't really do that more than weekly.
That makes sense.
It'd be tough.
Multiple times a day. There are a lot of people doing that.
And those have to be predominantly heavily automated and web-based. I mean, there's no real other way.
And they are majorly API projects, it seems.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
All right.
Moving on. Oh, there we go. Test environments.
Okay.
I mean, first, I'm just going to stop everyone here and say that BlackBerry is on this. I apologize. Quick and formal poll. If you have a BlackBerry phone that you're actively using that's not in, I have a suspicion that the only BlackBerry phones still out there are just in test environments that people are testing. No one's actually using them. So if you have a BlackBerry that you're using, just let me know now. All right, I'll let Harsh take it back.
All right, not a problem. Thank you. All right, so yeah, this indicates the proportion of people who said that they use different platforms for their browser testing and for the mobile phone testing. And you see that primarily it's Chrome on browsers. And I was a little surprised with IE being a little bit higher than Firefox in terms of proportion. And then we have other browsers as well.
Yeah, but I think that's probably a function of some of these lockdown systems. IE's been replaced with Edge. If you're still on IE, you have some sort of lockdown system, your IT department says you got to use IE 10 or whatever, and they haven't updated it.
And I mean, let's be honest. A lot of people are still using Internet Explorer because that's the internet that came on their laptop. I click on my internet button, I get the internet, and that's what it is. I'm more surprised that Dolphin's there because I don't know what that is. I've not heard of that.
I'll be honest, I don't have any clue.
There are very few people doing it. Like 34 people said that. It's a very small fragment. And then there's a Selenium angle to this out of the story.
I know.
Is there a Selenium angle to this whole story?
I mean, I think Firefox is up there because of the Selenium IDE that was available for a while. People were doing a lot of Selenium record and playback in Firefox, but now that that's kind of off the table, you can see people are shifting more towards Chrome, which has the vast majority of the market share for web traffic.
Yeah, our audience is chiming in, and Bijesh just made a comment that many companies use a lot of Microsoft tools, and some of them work properly only in IE.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's still a lot
Thanks,
of stuff
Bijesh.
that says, specifications. You got to use IE. Doesn't work
Absolutely.
in Firefox.
Yeah, and then on the phones, the iPhone and Android, obviously taking the market by storm there. We do have other was probably like Amazon Fires and other tablets and whatnot, but yeah, those are the vast majority of
Windows Phone. My wife was the last person I know to have a Windows Phone, and they deprecated.
Well, I mean, they're still available out in the world. I would like to say though that since my question, 0 people have told me that they're using a BlackBerry, so that's very important to note.
I think there's one big trend going on here too. Maybe people aren't evaluating and removing environments. You know what? I tested on BlackBerry 3 years ago. I keep running my tests on it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one of the reasons IE is so high.
100% science.
And
good point here. Governments. Someone just chimed in with governments locked down to using IE and Firefox.
Yep.
So that's
Thanks,
that.
Cyrus.
And I know that there are.
We're going to
Firefox
steal
does
that for the next webinar.
They use that stable release thing where they only release that one once every year or 2 years or something. So the governments
BSR.
definitely use that. That's a big one.
Nate says Selenium IDE is still in use. So that brings us to our next poll question, and that is: do you write Selenium scripts from multiple browsers? Yes or no?
Selenium scripts.
Yeah, hooking up all those different drivers.
I learned something interesting about the name of selenium the other day while we're on the topic, that according to the periodic table of the elements, it is the antidote for mercury poisoning.
I don't know if anybody got that joke right. Mercury, it was called mercury a long time ago.
Yes, well, that's why it's funny, because it's obscure.
Oh, okay.
All right. So
someone just said no. I think that was in regarding to my joke there.
All right, what do we get for a poll answer?
All right, so poll answers are just closing right now, and 64% say no. They do not write multiple scripts for multiple browsers. And
Interesting.
Yeah, that somewhat makes sense to me. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's not easy to do.
No,
it's a whole extra investment. And honestly, if it works in Chrome,
it's probably going to work. But I mean, it's still important to do some, high-level tests across the browsers that your customers are using. But
absolutely,
we certainly do. But
absolutely.
But I also don't support Dolphin, so.
We don't do it on purpose.
Oh, no. Next.
All right. So having talked about the front-end environments, now a little bit of talk about APIs. So we asked the question like, what APIs do you use for your testing, and whether they are internal to your organization or they are owned by some third party outside the organization. And most of the people said that their APIs are internal APIs. What they're testing against is something that is owned by a team across the building, or it's a team that sits next to them.
So the little fact checker in my head is screaming at me. Her name's Leanne. And I think the question was actually, which one do you primarily test?
Yeah, it doesn't mean that they're only testing internal APIs, but they are predominantly testing internals. And I mean, that makes sense, because if you think about it for your applications, you may have many internal APIs that run your one application that only has one external API that you're making available for your customers. So while you are testing all of them, you are more predominantly testing those internal APIs. And of course, we can't tell how many internal APIs are out there, but I heard a number, completely unscientific, that there's somewhere between 16 and 17,000 publicly available APIs, and it's probably gone up drastically since I heard that number. But think about how many internal APIs you have on a per product basis.
And then we asked them, what are you doing about it? What about if in case you have a third-party API, how are you fixing that problem? How are you testing against them? So 16% said that they do nothing if those APIs are unavailable. And 17% had no idea that something could be done using some solution like service virtualization. And the rest of them said that they primarily use mocking through scripting or some UI tool. So 17% had no idea that something could be done.
Why do I feel like that's probably overlapping with some of that manual tester? Who's testing APIs manually?
Yeah, well, we had one person saying they write the stuff in Postman before they automate it. But that makes sense.
Okay, I'll buy that.
But yeah, no, a third of the people just say, hey, when the APIs I'm testing are down,
I just sit there.
I get to go home. I think that's...
I'm sure they find something else useful to do, Greg. Not everybody's like you.
Yeah. Learn Java.
Learn Java. That's what you should be doing.
Right.
Right.
I love that.
Oh.
But more importantly, 17% had no idea.
Yeah,
could
you
do something else?
can.
About
So
unavailable
we've had customers that have come in and said, hey, look, when a third-party API that we have to have as part of our test is down, our entire testing halts because we're dependent on that. And we tell them, hey, you can virtualize that API and then continue to run your test because, hey, if Google Maps API is down, that's okay because, well, it's probably not okay, but at least
no.
we know that it's working. Their API works the way it should, so our tests shouldn't be dependent on that.
Right, like
Sure.
nothing could be an efficiency play. Like, it's going to be up tomorrow or something.
Yeah.
I had no idea I could do something. I mean, I hope everybody now knows they have an idea.
Everybody here knows.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially when 72% of those APIs are internal inside the organization.
No,
It should
but
not be
that
very
means
hard.
Somebody in your company knows how that API
Yes,
is supposed to work. That should make it pretty easy to mock or
Walk it
virtualize.
around. Yep,
And especially if it's not done, you can easily mock it.
easily. Okay. So
Future.
after looking at what's happening right now, what testers
Should
are
have a sound
saying,
effect there, like the future.
let's look at the future of testing. Well, so this slide indicates the percentage of API testers and UI testers who think that their tests are fully automated right now and will be automated 2 years into the future. So for example, around 24% of API testers said that they have full automation now, and 40% said that they expect to achieve full automation in 2 years from now. And similarly, on the right side, we have the percentage of QA engineers and QA managers amongst the overall respondents who believe that their tests are fully automated now and will be fully automated 2 years from now in the future. So there's a huge jump. You look at the API testers, the proportion has increased in the number, and the people who believe that 2 years from now there'll be full automation.
Yeah,
But
I think
UI,
that makes total sense with
a lot of
the API
optimism.
versus UI
Yeah.
because Jeff came up with this point yesterday, so I'm gonna steal it from him. That an API is designed to be consumed by a machine and is inherently more automatable than a UI, which is designed for a human, because humans have our own weird intricacies. So it's very difficult to automate the front end. That's why
Every time you make it foolproof, they come up with a better fool.
exactly
Right.
there's always a better fool out there. So yeah, I think the people here are hitting it right on that. There's very unlikely chance that we're going to be automating all of our front end tests in the next 2 years, but API tests,
I mean, it should
absolutely.
double. It should. This is one of my favorite slides, honestly.
2 years from now, only 18% of UI tests fully automated, like less than 20%. What do you think? Is it like a low ball number,
I
or is
think
it like
that makes
right in
sense.
Yeah, well,
place?
think about the applications that we have access to now versus what we had 2 years ago. And those same web applications or responsive apps on your mobile phone, those are going to be even more involved in 2 years, and it's going to be even more difficult to fully automate those. So the
It's
odds
the
that we're going to
fragmentation of
fragmentation of
Yeah,
stuff,
that's-
just the
that's the
amount
key.
of usability and dynamicism of those apps is going to keep changing.
Is that a
And-
word?
It is now.
Is there a reason that QA engineers are more optimistic than QA managers about the future?
I actually think this is a perspective thing.
Okay.
So the QA engineer, he looks at just his stuff, right? He knows, hey, I could automate more of my things
Yeah.
that I'm responsible for. That QA manager looks at the team and says, you know what, Steve's never gonna automate very much. He doesn't even
poor
even know
Steve.
he doesn't even know scripting.
Oh, Steve.
It's a perspective thing. They know where they're gonna fall short. I don't know. Doubling seem right?
Doubling for QA engineers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
That seems right. Probably.
yeah, most people think that in 2 years they're going to be doing better than they are now.
So yeah, if you're listening in and you think that you have a perspective on automation and the extent of automation of 2 years from now, I think this should adjust your perspective if in case you have been thinking that it's going to be lesser than 40% for APIs.
Yeah, and I
And
think
18% for
this
UI.
does say a little bit too about what people are looking for, right?
People
So
are
one of the
looking to automate.
takeaways here is that QA manager, he probably really wants to be at 50%, and he's just being a little realistic
Realistic error.
because of his team skills or whatever. If you're a QA engineer, you want to be the guy the QA manager wants to have. You don't want to be Steve who doesn't do scripting. I
Absolutely.
just woke somebody up named Steve.
Poor Steve.
he's awake now.
Okay,
Oh, we've
so
already reached the conclusion.
So yeah, that brings us to the end of the data presentation piece, and I think the conclusion is primarily on a number of areas, and I think you might have made your own conclusion from the data that we presented, and please share that interpretation with us. We'll get a chance to do that at the end of the webinar. But then this is what we interpret the data to be. Its automation is going to increase drastically within the next 2 years. We found that scripting proficiency and automation has a direct correlation. Adoption of Agile varies with the team size, and release cycles have gotten shorter, as you can see, for API testing and also for UI testing. It's moving on the left side. And virtualization is key, and it needs higher adoption in testing moving forward.
Absolutely. One point here, and feel free. So we do have some time left. I'm happy to continue the conversation, and I know Jeff and Harsh are as well. So please feel free to type in your questions, and we'll engage in some conversation. But the most recent one is: isn't full automation a moving target? And I personally believe absolutely. I mean, unless you have a very, very stable application, think those old banking applications built on COBOL. Can you automate it? You can probably automate an old COBOL application. But yeah, it is unlikely you're ever going to reach 100% automation for anything. I mean, API is much more likely, but on a UI, that's unreasonable.
Importantly, we did define full as 80 to 100%.
True,
yes. So we do recognize that full automation, you might still be 20% manual.
Yeah, but it's definitely it's something to aim for, but it's something that you're never going to hit. And obviously there are bunches of tests, like I mentioned, that have no need to be automated. They're just going to spend way more time building automation than it's going to save you.
I really do think that's a function of the application under test. If it's a website that has tons of dependencies and other things, you're not going to get to 80, 90% if it's fully dynamic and dependent on all these third-party stuff, because you got to keep changing all your tests. If it's something more stable that you release, quarterly, it's a desktop app, yeah, of course you can get up to 80%.
Yeah. Oh, this is my favorite one. Someone just said, "What is your most favorite API automation tool?"
Ooh,
I mean, that was not. That was. I mean, I don't think it was a plan. I mean, Harsh, I'll let you take this one.
Oh, it's a very hard question, but I think SOAP UI. It seems to be the right answer there. There's no other answer.
So is
there any other tool out there? I don't think so.
Obviously, we've tried to maintain our
oh, there we go.
Our biases.
Our viewers are commenting on that SOAP UI.
Yeah.
All right.
See? No.
Right.
Very well endorsed here.
We've one question. Why are scripting languages more suitable for automation? Why don't you mention programming languages? Yeah, I mean, there is the difference between compiled versus interpreted languages.
We did have some we said scripting languages because it's the use of the language, but we had C in there.
Yeah.
So we did actually have development languages in there. It turns out that the scripting languages are used more often than the full languages for automation.
Ooh, this is going to be a good one. What will the scope of using artificial intelligence be for testing in the next 2 years? Now, I don't know about the next 2 years, but I know there are some people that are looking into machine learning for test automation. There's a few different people in the industry out looking into it because I think that would be quite amazing if you could have a magical robot that's going to pour through your application, build out an object model, consistently take in feedback from what your users are actually doing, and then turning that into logical test cases that it then builds and runs. And that's an immense amount of processing, but I'm sure that we are going to get there someday.
Yeah.
Maybe not in 2 years.
Well, I think importantly, it might not be on the test execution side. It might be the first part of that is
designing the tests.
Designing tests.
Yep.
Because that's something that's actually pretty easy to do for machine learning, but it's not going to be super prevalent within 2 years. Don't everybody run out with machine learning.
A lot of our respondents on the survey said that AI is going to be the future and machine learning as well.
I think long-term, 5 years from now, look, AIs can do a lot of that, especially on the definition side, because they can handle tons of input and process it, good old big data, far better than a human can. That said, there will always be a place for that manual, subjective, ability-based testing.
There's an interesting question. What is the chance of using robotics in UI testing?
Using what? Robots?
Robots in UI testing?
I mean, there are robots. Robots are a thing. They're a thing that are in the world, and they are actually being used for testing. I was at a company, so I'm not going to name any names, but they were sick and tired of mobile automation not being up to snuff, and so they built a camera that would look at. They repurposed a camera that would look at the phones, and then they had a robot arm that would type in. So they could build their automation based on a robot touching the phone,
Physical device.
a physical device. It was incredible.
Yeah, I remember seeing ones that used to like just turn the machine, just turn the mobile tablet, switch from layout to portrait.
That's a
Before
good
that
point.
was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, using Test Complete, you
Dating
can,
myself.
when you're,
you can, but
Test Complete has mobile automation tool, and you can force a device to change into landscape and portrait mode. But yeah, before that was an option, you'd have to have a physical machine rotating for you.
But bluntly, robots are expensive and mechanical stuff breaks. So you're going to see a lot more software robots than hardware robots.
But then there is other thing that's called bots. That is essentially software pieces which are doing a job. There's a question around the role of bots in testing the next few years.
And I think
That's an
that's
interesting
something
one.
you're going to see a lot of.
Yeah.
There's some interesting stuff that's coming out there around things like drunken testing, which is actually a real term.
Yep.
Drunken
I mean,
testing.
you really have to get in a long line to get on that testing team.
I've heard of drunken noodles, drunken testing.
Drunken testing. Jeff, would you give us the 30-second on what that is?
Yeah, it's basically randomized inputs with some guidance, similar to how maybe you're not making the most logical decisions when you're drunk, but there's some process going on. So that's actually a neat thing to have bots go through. Take a model and walk through it oddly.
So there's a good question here. Do you think testing IoT devices is less explored or talked about? So as for Smartbear, IoT devices are all about integration between different protocols. We have good support for IoT in our tools, SoapUI and Ready API. And we support protocols like CoAP and MQTT. So if you're looking at IoT testing, then definitely look at our products, and in which you can do some integration testing between specific IoT protocols and REST and SOAP. So that is an area that we focus a lot on.
Yep, I like this one because I've knocked my microphone over. This is a point that I've gone to a couple times, and I always try to hit on this. Someone said, why automate an application when it takes more time to automate the test than it does to run manually? And you really have to look at it based on a time savings attitude, where if it's going to take me 5 hours to automate a task that only takes me 5 seconds to do, unless I'm having to do that task on such a repetitive basis that I'm going to save time, then it doesn't make sense to automate it. But think about those types of tests where it takes forever to perform, like the automated regression checks where you have to go through and verify bunches of data input, just standard walkthroughs of your application. That's where you can do the automation, because if you're not doing that testing, that's a likelihood that you'll find a defect in it. And manually testing that takes too long.
Yeah, I feel like it was almost a leading question, right? The answer is don't. I mean, come see my talk at Star West that's entitled Don't.
Don't. Why automate? Don't. No, I talk to a lot of people, and building, again, shifting left, developers, huge automation frameworks. I talk to a ton of companies that say, look, we have a task that takes us 10 hours every 2 weeks, and we can build automation for it in 2 hours. I want to rebuild that automation every 2 weeks, and I'm going to throw it out every time our application updates because it's going to save me 8 hours. And that's fine. That's a great use for an automation
math
tool.
Really quick.
It was 10 minus 2.
Oh. Sorry, I think I stopped paying attention.
Sorry, wow. Wow.
I will say, too, one big piece there is people don't remember to break down their tests into smaller pieces. You can combine manual and automated. You don't have to automate the whole thing.
Yep.
Absolutely not. So there's a question, is it possible to do IoT load testing with Smartbear software? Yes, it is. With Ready API, you can do load testing.
By the way, anybody
Check
who's
out our
like
trials.
these 8 billion questions, we'll respond to.
Yeah, we're going to go pour through these because my eyes are getting bad in my old age, but I'm trying my best to read all these. Oh, I'm getting a wrap it up sign. No, an extend time. Next question. The marketing team isn't. I'm going to look over here real quick.
I think she just wanted you to duck.
Oh, we have another slide. There it is. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for coming at this webinar and looking at our report. And thanks for attending. And we'll be sending everyone the first copies of the full report that contains the results of the survey by the end of this week. And if you're local to the greater Boston area, you should join us in September for our user conference.
Even if you're not local, come
yeah,
over.
come up to Smartbear Connect.
Yeah, from anywhere. Come to Smartbear Connect and come to our conference that will consist of live interactive product training classes and insights from industry experts and our Smartbear customers. And we'll be dropping in the link in the chat box for you to buy the tickets for that.
Excellent. Yeah, and like Harsh mentioned, we're sending out all of the data from the survey. So we did pull out, obviously, what we thought was most insightful. But you'll have everything, the questions, all of the data. So I know there were a few points in there where some people were confused about the respondents. You'll have all of that data. And if you have any other insights that you pull from this, please feel free to reach out to us, because we're more than happy to engage and find out what the user community is actually doing.
And one last thing, too. Please give us feedback on the actual webinar. That's always appreciated.
Yes, another quick informal poll. How well did I do today?
Wow, Greg.
I mean, Harsh was late, and Jeff didn't like my jokes.
You know, if you guys like this kind of thing, it's important that we know that, so we put our efforts into doing this kind of webinar again.
Mm-hmm.
If what you didn't like, maybe we can change it. We're always happy to replace people. And you know, please give us some feedback on that. It's appreciated. But thank you for your attention. Thank you for filling out the survey if you're one of the respondents, and thanks for bearing with us for the last hour.
Excellent. We're getting a lot of will watch agains, A+s. Half of them are from our marketing team, so I think they're just trying to lift my ego. But thank you guys all for joining us today. And again, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you want the matinee presentation, we'll be here. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.